All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for attending tonight's Planning Commission meeting. As always, we start with the Pledge of Allegiance, so please rise and join me in the pledge. Ready, begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, can we have roll call, please?
Chair Baldino.
Here.
Vice Chair Newman is absent. Commissioner Keldoff.
Here.
Commissioner Heschler.
I'm here.
And Commissioner McGuire is absent.
All right, thank you, Venus. Next is the time on the agenda for public communications, the opportunity for the public to address the Planning Commission on anything not on the agenda. Seeing no one in the room, I will go ahead and close public communication. Next, written communications. We have several emails which are related to agenda item H3. Besides these emails, are there anything else?
Yes, thank you, Chair. What was also distributed in your packets were the 2022 and 2023 Planning Commission forecasts for the remainder of 2022 and what we have kind of lined up for the next year.
You saying that was a hard copy?
Yes, and we can go ahead and get into that in more detail at the end of the agenda.
Oh, I got it now. All right.
Yeah, so those will be used for discussion at the end of the agenda tonight.
Was the email I received about this agenda, was that forwarded?
Yes, it is included.
Okay, great. All right. All right, our consent calendar has several meeting minutes. I hope everyone had a chance to review them. Anyone want to pull any of those or make any modifications? Otherwise, I'll accept a motion to approve the consent calendar.
Except for the ones from 2015, where,
Yeah, even I'm going back. It was like me and Brenda. Remember, Brenda, that meeting? Jeez.
yeah, I make a motion to
Okay, we have a
approve.
motion to approve consent. I'll second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Hey. All right, next continued business, none. That brings us to our agenda item H2. We're going to talk about a presentation of the draft 2021-29 revised housing element update. And can we have a staff report on this, please?
Yes, we're going to go ahead and turn this over to our city's housing consultant, who'll give a brief presentation. While she gets online, I'll just go ahead and provide a brief history. As you know, this came before the commission back earlier this year, right? So back in January. So that went ahead. There were some changes made, got forwarded to council. Council went ahead and approved it. We submitted to HCD. HCD came back with some revisions that we need to do. We've been working closely with our housing consultant, Veronica Tam and Associates in her office, as well as having a couple meetings with HCD personnel to kind of go over hopefully what will be the last of the revisions necessary, but I don't want to jinx that. But just know that we have been in contact with them to hopefully get to the point where this will be satisfactory to their office. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn that over to our consultant who is joining us remotely on Zoom.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to present the revised housing element to you. What I'd like to do is definitely go through the update process that we have went through in developing the housing element. We have done quite a few community outreach throughout the process. There were 3 housing element workshops in 2021 in order to develop the overall draft housing element. I don't want to read everything like line by line, but it's definitely it's been a long process. We've taken a lot of community input in throughout that process. We came up with a draft housing element back in September 2021 and sent that off to HCD for their review. We have multiple calls with the state and to talk about revisions necessary, and we resubmitted that to the state for their review and went ahead and adopted the housing element February 1st, 2022, within the grace period that was allowed at the time. After that, HCD took 3 months to look at the housing element or 2 months to get the housing element, and they came back with some additional comments. And this next few slides summarize some of the key comments. We certainly have narrowed down the comments that we got from the first letter. We have addressed the majority of the letter, the comments from the first letter, and with this revised adopted housing element, we have some remaining revisions. Regarding the affirmatively furthering fair housing, the state wanted us to talk a little bit more about how the city's fair housing efforts interacted with the overall regional efforts. So in the AFFH analysis, we talked more about how the city was part of the regional fair housing study. We also expanded the analysis of how the site inventory interacts with AFFH factors. That's all in the appendix. We also added insights from the regional fair housing study. That was something that the state was asking for. Also talked a little bit more about the city's history in terms of zoning, in terms of housing tenure kind of trends in the community and access to transportation. And finally, we have beefed up the city's actions to address fair housing issues. The next set of comments relates to the site inventory, and that's very typical. Having the sites to meet the regional housing needs allocation is one of the most critical components of the housing element. And so the state wanted more discussions on the methodology for selecting the sites and calculating capacity, and also whether the sites are suitable for future development within the next 8 years, and whether there are any significant environmental and infrastructure constraints. One thing that we'll go into detail later on is that a key change to this housing element is that we have revised the strategy for meeting the regional housing needs allocation. The sites inventory has gone through more major changes compared to other parts of the housing element. I'll go into details about that later on. The state also has some comments regarding the city's overall land use control, really focused on just the development, the zoning called MDR, and this is really an overlay. So we kind of clarified how this MDR works and try to make it more easier to use in the future. The state also wants us to talk about the CUP process, but essentially, there's not the city doesn't use CUP process to process housing development typically, except for larger projects. And we also have some additional actions in addressing CUP in the future. We also clarified about the city's fees in terms of they're more concerned about the CUP process and the CUP fees, but then because the city of El Segundo doesn't use CUP very often, it's not a significant concern. There are also comments relating to how the city addressed reasonable accommodation and group homes for 7 or more. These are the requirements of state law, so we clarify how the city is going to address it in the revised draft housing element. And finally, in terms of housing programs, the state really wants us to make sure that we provide adequate sites for the RHNA, and because we have revised the site strategy, this program has also been updated to reflect that changes in strategy. And we also updated Program 8 to make sure that we provide, we address the reasonable accommodation and also persons with group homes for 7 or more people. So just in summary, the key changes to this particular draft housing element is in fact the strategy to meet the RHNA with the sites inventory. what we have done is updated the mixed-use overlay based on current status of some of those sites. The city it proposes to increase the density with the mixed-use overlay, but we moved some of the sites so that we're a little bit more. The mixed-use overlay focused on really just primarily three areas in the site's inventory. Under the direction of the city council, the staff is proposing to expand the housing overlay to portions of the R3 zone, and that way we are increasing the density in some of the portions of the R3 zone, allowing some existing R3 zoning properties to kind of recycle into a higher use. The expansion again of the housing overlay is directed by City Council. This is just a quick overview. If you remember the old map of the old mixed-use overlay, it actually covers a lot more sites. I think it was 14 sites or so, but now it's really focusing on 3 different areas for the mixed-use overlay. When it comes to the housing overlay, the brown areas represent where the R3 zoning is located currently, and with the blue hatch pattern overlay is where the housing overlay is going to be is being proposed on. So it's not the entire R3 zoning, and the overlay covers probably about half of the properties in the R3 zoning. But within the R3 zoning, not every property would have ability to really recycle into higher density. We did a lot of analysis in terms of existing uses, the size of the property, the number of existing units on site, the age of the structure, and excluding condominiums that are unlikely going to be recycled into higher density multifamily. With that, we've really only focused on some potential sites for a few areas. These are the areas that are primarily currently occupied by non-conforming uses that are like primarily non-residential uses, older industrial areas, and also there is a religious facility property that's being vacated, and also I think a restaurant that can also be recycled into higher density. So combine the overlay, mixed use overlay and the housing overlay, we're utilizing just about 5 or 6 areas in order to meet the regional housing needs allocation. So in summary, the RHNA is 521 units of overall obligation. We're proposing to actually increase the ADU trend based on historic records. We are able to increase, we think we're able to increase the ADU credits from 80 units to 120 units. We have also entitled projects. The largest property project is the Pacific Coast Commons. And with the rest of the RHNA, we're going to fulfill that with the mixed-use overlay, with some excess capacity, which is required by the state to provide a buffer. As we know that when housing does develop, they are less likely to be primarily lower income, so we do have to have a buffer based on state law to make sure that we have a no net loss in capacity over time. So with that, we're really ready to move on, hopefully, to readopt the housing element and submit this to the XCD again. So tonight we'll get comments on the revised draft housing element. We're going to the City Council for readoption of the housing element in November, and after that we will have to submit the readopted housing element for the state review for 60-day review. With that, I actually conclude my presentation. Paul, or Eduardo, do I send it back to you regarding the recommendation?
Yeah, we just send it back to us. That's fine. It's more for our TV viewing audience.
Okay.
Staff have anything to add to that presentation?
No, just, we recommend that you hold a public hearing, take comment, provide us your comments. If there's anything you think that we need to add or do edits to the element, we can do that before we go to council. And with that, to adopt the resolution recommending adoption of the housing element.
What was the total housing number we sent in the original draft? If now the revision is, if you can go back to that slide, we're supposed to get 500 and we're telling we're gonna get 1,000 units? Okay, that one. So what did we originally propose when it first went up to the state? Because that was one of the directions we gave the consultant, is reduce that number.
Yeah, I'd have to look into that, just to refresh my memory, Chair.
Okay.
I think, Chair, if I can just chime in,
Yeah.
well, if Paul's able to get the exact numbers. It was a lower number than the 1,000 when we took it to council and submitted it to the state originally. But because of some of the feedback that we've gotten from the state and our modified methodology of identifying the site's inventory, we've, in order to achieve the ratio of lower, moderate, and above moderate units, we needed to provide a certain cushion. And so the number is higher than what it was when we originally submitted to the state, but that was so that we could at least hit the baseline for, and if I remember correctly, and hopefully Paul can find it, we were having a hard time meeting the baseline number for lower income units. And so we had to increase the densities, or when we increased the densities, and then it achieved a higher overall number. So the more we eat away with that, the harder it's gonna be to substitute those sites inventory when and if they get developed and they don't include affordable housing units. And so that's why the number increased a little bit, but hopefully we get the actual increase. But anecdotally, it did increase.
Can you give us a little background on the back and forth between the city and the housing department since they gave the comments? Just kind of describe how many meetings, what these meetings are like, and if in fact it is a negotiation, or is it you need to do X in order to get?
I definitely would not categorize it as a negotiation. The feedback is, in most cases, we're seeking sort of quantifiable, have we checked this box off in terms of satisfying statutory law. But in many cases, there are not metrics or quantifiable ways of determining whether we've checked that box. And so it's not necessarily a negotiation, but it's a discussion with HCD. And we've had a couple of meetings where they say, hey, you need to beef up the strategies that the city is committing to in terms of addressing affirmatively furthering fair and affordable housing. And we discuss different ways that we can do that is not quantifiable but more programmatic based, like advocating and promoting and advertising and holding workshops for disadvantaged community members to learn about, housing opportunities and housing rights that they would be subject to or could take advantage of. But that's not a metric that, when they look for a metric for something like that, they ask us to commit to, okay, hold one community meeting where this is where you discuss and have at least 50 community members attend that meeting. And so it's not necessarily a negotiation, it's a discussion about how we can satisfy the goals of state legislation when it's not necessarily something that can be quantified.
So can I ask Michael, in that scenario, are they looking for programming ideas to encourage it versus policy that is actually paving the way for more of these units?
I'd say it's a fair amount of both. There's not a formula that they'll accept, and it has to be a combination of all the above. And Veronica, if I'm not including any context, Veronica's our specialist, our expert, and she can definitely provide better context than staff can. But I think I've covered it.
So I think it's definitely both in terms of policy relating to land use. That's important because meeting the arena and having the buffer is it's essential. It's a critical component of that. but once you have the sites available programmatically, how do you actually encourage and facilitate some of that development? In terms of the buffer, the recommendation is at about 30% of the lower income, but in order to hit the 30% of lower income, right now we actually don't have 30% of lower income. We have 20% of the lower income buffer. In order to hit that, you really have to assume that somehow market rate housing is going to occur as well, and that's why there is an increase in the overall capacity. But primarily, what we have done is reduce the number of mixed-use sites in the commercial areas, but look for non-conforming uses in the residential area that could increase recycle into housing. And as mentioned before, that was a direction of the city council.
And so without an inclusionary housing ordinance, how are we allocating our assumption on what percentage is going to be low, moderate?
Yeah. And that's exactly without inclusionary, like technically you can claim that all of the high density housing is going to be feasible for low income, but you know that without an inclusionary policy, it's not likely going to happen. So what we have done is actually relatively generous at this point, like about 40% of the sites are assumed to be lower income, and that's definitely higher than an inclusionary policy would ask for, but lower than basing it purely on density, whether it's feasible. And again, that's the reason why we would need that buffer.
And the challenge there, over the next 6 or 7 years will be the city using the development agreement as a tool. The $5.3 million that we have sitting for affordable housing as a tool, possibly inclusionary housing if appetite comes back to talk about that, or partnering with nonprofit housing providers to look for opportunities to develop and build affordable housing, or either write down the cost to develop and build affordable housing. Additionally, there's state laws that have passed that mandate that there's a replacement of any affordable housing units or protected housing units, even if there's no covenant restriction. Units that exist today, if a property is redeveloped, units that exist today that meet certain income qualifying criteria then have to be replaced in the new development. And so things like that moving forward. I don't know if there's an answer to this, Veronica, but I don't know if those will count towards RHNA in the future if they become covenant restricted affordable units.
Unfortunately, it's a net increase, and so I think the replacement requirement would say you wouldn't necessarily count it towards your RHNA, and RHNA is new production, so it's a net increase. So that's also part of the reason why when we're looking at the sites in the housing overlay, we're focusing on sites that currently doesn't have housing on it, or that would give you less of a liability or burden to replace those units because they're developed with non-conforming use, and so there's no existing housing to be replaced.
Okay, so we won't get credit, but it'll come down to us trying to write down the cost using our own funds, grants, partnerships, or private-public partnership, or something like an inclusionary housing ordinance.
And can you guys talk about the ADU factor? Because in the staff report, it mentioned that a number of those are going to be, we think, affordable. And I'm just curious what the process going into that is. Like, what makes us think that those are going to be rented at below market?
For the ADU, we are allowed to estimate the number of ADUs for the purpose of addressing the RHNA from an adequate sites perspective. We are using we're allowed under state law, like the safe harbor rule, to project into the future based on the past 3-4 years of average permits. And because of that, we were able to, assume about 15 units a year for 120 units over 8 years. The income distribution right now is not based on, it's not saying that you are requiring the units to be rented at lower income. The income distribution, again, is based on a HCD approved study conducted by SCAG. That SCAG did a rent study within the 6 county areas and come up with an income distribution of about 40-something% that's lower, very low income, and another 20% or so for low income. That income distribution is based on a study conducted by SCAG and approved by HCD to be used for our projection. So now in reality, when you actually build those ADUs, they may or may not be affordable at market, but from the perspective of a site inventory, we are allowed to use that study.
And if we're counting them as affordable, are they monitored by like a many mansions? Do we have to prove that they are affordable?
No, it's a formula. The state allows us to count so many ADUs,
Wow.
and they don't even check if they may not even be rented out.
I thought the formula was how many we can say go to arena numbers, but after the fact, there's no.
It's like we get a credit
comment.
because it's an ADU, and we're allowed to allocate so many as affordable without even checking if that's truth.
So no follow-up, look back yet.
Got it.
And the state's okay with that?
It's the state's idea.
At
Okay.
this time.
All right.
I think that'll probably change in the future.
Yeah, who's gonna rent their ADU at below market?
Let me ask, so when we did Pacific Coast Commons, we entered a development agreement, we got to negotiate with them, and that's how we got affordable units, because we gave them building entitlements, and in exchange, we got affordable units. We go through with this plan and we rezone and allow density by right, then how do we negotiate to get affordable units, which is the reason why we're rezoning this, right? If I'm a developer and I've got density rights on a property that the city has given away for nothing, what's the motivation for that developer to get any affordable units there, and why wouldn't they just do everything at market?
That's a good question. Primarily, what's going to drive that is when a developer's still looking for something above and beyond, or they're utilizing state density bonus law, which mandates affordable housing anyhow. So they're going to take the base density of 65 units to the acre, utilize state density bonus law to get their max of an additional 30%. And then they'll have to provide the minimum, depending on the ratio, the minimum of anywhere between 11 to 15% affordable, depending on what the ratio is. As the economy progresses, there's still going to be a financial incentive for a developer to build more units than what this density is going to allow. But you're right, if the zoning code is amended, and somebody just wants to come in and do strictly per code that density, our leverage has been minimized at that point.
Right, because we've given away these development rights with the idea that we're going to get more housing, but the goal is to get more affordable housing.
Yeah.
But by giving away these rights, we're kind of harming ourselves in our ability to negotiate or leverage.
Well, I'd say the overall goal is just to build housing. But if you're going to focus on affordable housing, then there's other strategies to accomplish that, either through inclusionary housing, or you could lower the density and offer some sort of scaled graduation that then triggers an inclusionary component or triggers a development agreement. I mean, there's different mechanisms to do that. We're not identifying what the structure of this is going to be. There's a density range that we're offering, and our projections are based on the lower of the density range. And so we could certainly look at, and if that's some of the direction, look at starting at the lower of the density, the lower baseline of the density range,
and then require a development agreement for anything more than that, or, there's different ways that we can structure that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Allow them if, you want to go beyond that, requires a development agreement. It could be zoned for that, but then at least we have a conversation about what can we do about hitting these numbers that we need for affordable housing.
And what is the state's, what do they really care about? Us hitting a certain number of units or the affordability? Because to me, yeah, to your point, we're creating an opportunity for housing, but if that's not their main driver, then we're just gonna get ourselves in trouble again.
They want us to do it all. They want us to facilitate the production of housing, and they also want the RENA allocation of affordable units to be met.
But with Pacific Coast Commons, we're already gonna meet our above moderate
That's correct.
number.
Yeah.
So then we really just need to be focused on those other categories. And I don't
Well-
know if this does that.
And just to be clear, if we meet and exceed a category above moderate, those numbers do not count towards the rest of the RENA numbers.
That's right.
What's the density of Pacific Coast Commons? What was that build out?
83 units to the acre.
83. And we're proposing down Imperial to do up to 70?
75 to 85.
75. Is there a height restriction on that? Are we now talking high rises on Imperial Avenue that is,
When we come back to you to implement the overlays, we will also present to you proposed development standards that will help accomplish the densities that we're permitting. Because we can't increase the density and keep the height at 26 feet, right?
Oh, I know.
It wouldn't be
Is
impossible
that,
to
what is the
accomplish.
height right now on Imperial?
In the R3 zone,
No, R3.
in the
Yeah.
R3 zone,
So
it's
it's a three-story
26
townhome.
feet. Yeah.
apartment building?
Taller than that, aren't they?
There might be some
There are
really
existing ones that are
non-conforming.
taller, but,
Everything's really old over there.
yeah.
Let's have a conversation about the consequences if we don't satisfy what the state wants us to do with this housing plan.
The short answer is they won't certify our housing element, and we will lose essentially all authority to regulate housing in El Segundo. There's a recent article that was published about Santa Monica, or primarily about Santa Monica, and the developer in particular taking advantage of Santa Monica not having a certified housing element and being able to come in and propose a development that pencils for them, and the city has no choice. They have to process it under that premise, and HCD's already come back and ruled in on that. And so that's the short answer. There's all kinds of other sticks that the state has in issuing fines, coming after us, for, suing the city. And there's an array of other state laws that we'd be subject to, lose federal or lose state funding. There's all those types of things as well, with not having a certified housing element.
So we created our own housing element based on public communication and input from the commission and city council. We sent it up to the state housing department. They sent back their comments and instructed us that if we wanted to have this certified, we needed to make changes, correct?
There are, modifications that they requested.
Okay. And if we don't make these modifications, then they're basically telling us we would not get certification.
It's unlikely that they would certify our housing element.
Okay, and if we don't get certification from the state, then we're basically left open to any developer coming in and developing whatever they want, as long as it meets certain criteria, and we would have to allow them to build that as a matter of right.
Yeah,
So the
short answer.
consequences of not being certified are much worse than if we push through what the state is telling us to push through, even though we may not disagree with it,
Right.
or we may not agree with it.
Yeah, the housing element that we're proposing and working through with HCD preserves as much local control as we currently have.
Okay, but the stick is we are being forced to concede with what the state wants us to put in our housing element in order to get certification, because the consequences of not getting certification are much worse.
Yeah, I can flesh that out as far as the consequences. So, like the example you guys were saying, where in Santa Monica there might be crammed down approvals. So, for certain affordable housing projects, they may be required, mandated to be approved, even though they're not compliant with zoning or the general plan. The city would have a difficulty for other projects and subdivision approvals to approve them and get them permitted, because you can't find general plan consistency when you don't have a housing element that's approved. And there could also be other consequences for mandated project approvals, the ability of the city to issue building permits, and other map approvals. So it's a serious deal to not have a valid current housing element.
We would lose basically all of our local control if we don't have a certified housing element with the state.
And funding.
And our funding as well. So basically, if we don't do what the state wants us to do with this revised housing plan, our consequences are pretty dire.
Yeah, I think it's a fair summary.
Okay.
And I'd like to add too, and also think about this too, is a developer came in and just built whatever, we would have, again, no say as to how it looks like. As Paul alluded to earlier, when, if this does, pass muster, we come back with some R3 development standards. If we can, that would allow us to at least put in some, objective design standards, kind of similar to what we did with SB 9, if you recall, where we mandated that, any, subdivision that goes through SB 9 have a porch. Same thing we can do here. We can put in some objective design standards to at least minimize, bulk and mass, because, we all know that in order to get the density that it's calling out for, you're gonna have to increase the height. So instead of having big boxes, maybe we can, tailor those development standards in a way that requires some articulation, some step backs, and some other, ways in which to minimize bulk and mass and the apparentness of those structures as well. That at least gives us that opportunity, some control over, at least if nothing else, the design. Whereas without that, a developer can come in and build a big box, big square cube.
Can we pull up a map of what some of those sites are in the inventory? Is that?
Yeah.
There's the one, the mixed-use overlay. Is that a park in Smoky Hollow? Because city-owned?
Yeah, it's actually private property, and Paul will get the map up, but that is private property known as Wiley Park.
Got it. So the city doesn't own
The
it.
city does not own that.
Isn't that part of another development already? That's coming to us pretty soon?
It's across the street.
Oh, okay, but I thought they were gonna put parking on that park.
I don't think we know what they're gonna.
Oh, okay. I met with them a couple of years ago. Yeah, so that's Wiley Park, and then what is that on PCH? Bank of America building?
At the very top, it's the Bank of America building, and then below that, it's the IHOP and Stickenstein locations.
Okay, so we know someone has bought Stickenstein, they want to develop apartments. By rezoning this, are we gonna lose our ability to negotiate with this developer and get low-income housing in that development? Because we're basically saying, hey, you get this housing overlay, he's already purchased it, he's already said what his plan is, which is apartments. So are we, in trying to get more affordable housing, allowing just more market rate housing to be built by right?
That may be the case, but we don't have the definite plans of
From him.
that particular developer. We've seen some concepts,
Yeah.
but we don't know yet exactly how high the density will go in their development.
And the units that we have to build, there's no differentiation between whether they're rental or for sale, but obviously it's harder to achieve the affordability as for sale versus rental.
Yeah, that's correct.
Is it too late to put an overlay on the travel lodge? Because there's one thing I want to get rid of on PCH, it's probably the travel lodge.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think if the commission wanted to suggest we add that site,
I would add the travel lodge and remove Stickenstein. I'm sure they're about the same size.
It's an interesting
Well,
idea.
there's
I've never heard anything good come out of that travel lodge.
There's an issue of feasibility and demonstrating feasibility to HCD. So if we remove the Stickenstein, which is a vacant site,
Yep.
and add the travel lodge, which is occupied by a motel that does business, we might not be able to demonstrate that, oh yeah, it's feasible based on the HCD's guidelines. We can add that site in order to incentivize redevelopment, but removing the stick-in-time site may jeopardize our numbers when it comes to meeting the HCD RENA requirement.
No, I get the logic of that, and I might be okay with just adding the travel lodge and pray for something to happen there. But I guess maybe it's just me trying to be logical. I think if we explain to them that, look, we know someone's gonna develop apartments here, and if you make us do an overlay, it's gonna be really hard for us to get any affordable units here. But if you're saying, I understand goal one is we have to get this approved and get this certified, or else we're in trouble. So I don't wanna cause any wrinkles. I'm just trying to think, are we setting us up for failure when this project comes to us? Because we've already given them a density bonus that basically, if we weren't forced to do this, then he would come to us and we'd have a development agreement and we'd be able to have a negotiation and we get some public benefits.
Chair, I think what I'm hearing is, and this will be relevant in our next discussion, or one of our discussions tonight about the R3 density, is that the goal is not to, maybe the goal should be established the density at the lowest metric, and that still forces a DA in order for somebody to realize a project that would pencil. We know that based on the analysis, which we'll discuss later, that a range of anywhere between 75 and upwards to 115 or so is the range that projects begin to pencil in the R3 zone or along PCH. And so what I'm hearing is that when we get to that point where we're bringing a zone text amendment back to the commission, the strategy should be, let's start low and develop a bracket where it triggers anything more than that, triggers the DA. So that way, either A, we get it through the DA, or B, they take advantage of state density bonus law, and we get the affordable housing through that. That's what, am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, that sounds like a good way to approach it.
So the ability to bring back an inclusionary housing ordinance, just remind me, that went away once it got to council.
It went away for now. The direction was to utilize, that was a grant-funded study. The direction was to utilize that grant-funded study to come back to the commission and council with the results of studying what it would take to facilitate redevelopment of the R3 zone, which we'll discuss on another item tonight.
Do you guys have any more comments? Because I've got a whole.
Isn't there public, we supposed
Yeah.
to do public comment?
Yeah, you should. Nothing else? You want to hear public comments? Okay. Mark, I hope you have public comments, because now is the time for public communications. Anyone wishing to address the planning commission, now's your time. Going once? No? Well, thanks for coming. Okay, I'll close public communication. So I had a good meeting with Michael about this, and my concerns were, it sounds like the state is telling us how, not only the goals, but how we reach those goals and the steps we're going to take to reach those goals. It sounds like the state is writing this document for us under the threat, if you don't do what we want, you won't get certified, and then you're in real trouble. So I understand the consequences of not getting it certified mean that, I will go along with the recommendation of the consultants. If this gets certified, then that's good. But my concern is when you read through this, it says the city will do such and such. And those are things that haven't come before a planning commission or a city council. And so we're basically promising the state will do things. And I asked, well, can we have language that the city will consider, the city will evaluate, the city will investigate? And he was like, no, they want actionable items. So I don't want to make any changes to the actual housing, but I think our resolution can be adjusted so it's a little bit more factually accurate of the situation we happen to find ourselves in. One of the problems I have is when we talk about, on page 44F on the resolution, that in addition, the city reviewed the project's environmental impacts under California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, and the regulations. And an initial environmental impact study was performed and demonstrated the proposed project would not cause any significant environmental impacts. When you read that environmental CEQA study, what it says over and over, and I have it here, is that the housing plan would not result in the approval, and I'm reading, this is from the November 21 CEQA, page 1145. The project, which is talking about the proposal, would not result in the approval of any physical improvements. The housing element includes an inventory of sites that are adequate to accommodate the city's assigned share of regional housing needs, but it does not propose development projects. Inasmuch as the housing element could indirectly result in residential development, each potential development site would be evaluated at the time of development proposal in accordance with the requirements of CEQA. So the CEQA report that we produced to justify that this document won't have any negative environmental impacts basically says that the reason it doesn't have any environmental impacts because this document doesn't actually improve any projects.
Just a piece of paper.
It's just a piece of paper saying what you're going to do. So I propose that when we have a resolution, and for F, G, and H, that is pretty standard language I've seen over and over when we have had an actual CEQA analysis and found there's no impact, that we add to this the language I just read from the actual CEQA document. That explains that the CEQA analysis reached the conclusion because there are no actual projects being proposed in the housing element. It's just a proposal. And then can we also include in there that any projects that come under this proposal will have a separate CEQA analysis? Because I want to make sure that if someone does come in, we at least look at the impact of adding this type of density west of Maine on Imperial, where, you know, it's already dense over there when you talk about traffic and congestion and everything else.
Yeah, we can add that.
I think that's smart.
Do we have consensus? Michelle, do you agree?
Yeah.
Okay. And then let me see what else I have on the resolution. And then I want to add something about any affirmative statement made in the housing element about what will be accomplished is an acknowledgement that this will go through the processes of the Planning Commission and the City Council and be evaluated in normal course. Something so that my concern is 8 years from now, when we pass this thing and we get certified and we're all happy with ourselves, and then the state comes back to us and says, you have not accomplished all the things you said you would accomplish. And the language in this report, as an attorney, says, we will do these things. I'm concerned that 8 years from now, when they come back to us, they're going to say, well, because you didn't do those things, now you're mandated, you have to do these things. And you have to do additional things on top of it. So I want to at least have some language in there, Joaquin, in our resolution that acknowledges that the state required us to use assertive language saying we will do certain aspects. It is the intent of the city to follow through and use our best faith abilities to evaluate each potential proposal in here.
And it's subject to our legislative
Subject to
authority,
legislative
right.
process and the approval of the city council, right? Because like inclusionary housing, if we say we're going to do it and the city council says we're not going to do it, well, there's one thing we haven't done in our housing element.
I think the reso is a great place for that.
What's that?
I think the reso is a great place to highlight that.
Yeah, and it's more just for educating ourselves
Yeah.
8 years from now when we go back and look, because I don't want anyone sitting up here to say, well, you know, at the time, we did agree to do all these things and we haven't done it, so maybe we are the bad actors here, but we are being coerced. We are signing an agreement under duress, because if we don't agree with what the state wants us to do, the consequences are much worse. So I just want to have something in the resolution that kind of summarizes how we got to where we are, why we're making the decisions we're making, so that we can go back and if the state says, oh, you didn't do these things, they say, well, yeah, but look at our preamble. You set us up in a position to where you made us make these commitments to you that haven't gone through our legislative process. So we tried, but if we get a CEQA analysis that says there are extreme environmental impacts for having 70 units, far down PCH, I don't think we should be obligated to go through with it. Either the project makes sense, it's going to work, or it's not. And I get that it's a plan and it's a goal, and that's all great. I guess I just have fear of the state using this against us 10 years down the line if we're not careful. And I do believe I'm going to work hard to try to make these goals and make everything work, but this is a big ask in a very small town without a lot of land. And so to think that we're going to build 1,000 new units in 10 years, I think is a little far-fetched. So I want to hedge our bets. I want to protect us in the future. I want to have a document that reflects more of the reality of what's going on. And I think just that CEQA language was the only one I read and said, we haven't really done CEQA. We've done a report that says we haven't done CEQA because we don't need to do CEQA. So if you make that change, and then I think, Joaquin, you understand the language I want for the, this language should not be intended as this is a done deal. There's a process we will go through. Any objections to that second paragraph I'm trying to throw in there?
No.
I should have wrote it out before, so it was a little more articulate.
Got it.
You agree?
Yeah.
Okay, there's only 3 of us. We got to be like the 3 Musketeers, otherwise nothing gets done
Otherwise,
today.
we're doing it again.
Right. Okay, any other questions about
Well,
this?
the other thing I'm concerned about is, if this program does provide the opportunity to build 1,000 units in the next 10 years, 900 of those are going to be, or 980 of those are going to be market rate or above. And so I'm concerned that we're not going to meet our RENA numbers, and we're going to always be playing catch up on that. And maybe that's always the case, that there's always new RENA thresholds, but I mean, we're going to hit market rate, no problem. We're going to hit that
Yeah.
category. And so
We
we're
already
going to,
have.
yeah, exactly, because
We
of
will
Pacific
have,
Coast
yeah.
comments. And so are we creating policy that just allows for even more density of the market rate and doesn't fulfill RENA at all? And is there any
I
solution
think
to
we
that?
absolutely are, but if we don't do what they want us to do, then we face even worse consequences.
No, I understand that. I'm just
I
wondering,
just
is
think
there
their
any?
logic of thinking this is going to lead to affordable housing is a little skewed because we're giving up development rights that people would negotiate with.
But then
Yeah.
that's on us to then create the corresponding policy that encourages it to be affordable and not market rate.
That's right. That's the only way that it works.
It would only be inclusionary, right? That's what you're saying.
What's our second best option?
Well, the development agreement is a great tool.
Yeah, I think your plan for that, you get a minimum density and then everything else is allowable with a development agreement because then we can have a conversation and start haggling over how many affordable units we can get. But no, I agree. We're basically rezoning, letting people build by right, and there is no requirement right now that any of those are affordable. So if they come in and just want to build what we're rezoning at, they get to do that all market rate, and we don't really get any benefit other than more market rate housing. But I don't think there's anything we can do about it. It's what the state wants us to do.
The other tools are more programmatic. It's strategies that, commission, council, and staff need to develop in utilizing the $5.3 million and partnering with nonprofit housing providers out there, working with developers who want to do this out of the kindness of their hearts and pockets, who want to partner with the city and other programmatic approaches of incentivizing it.
And listen, affordable housing is still profitable housing to the developer. So there are groups who will come in and want to do this because it makes them money. Programmatically, I think we just have to encourage that if that's our goal, is to meet that part of the housing element.
All right, any other comments, guys? Any other edits?
Not to the housing element.
Not to the housing element? Does anyone else want to save the moose at this last minute before
I
it
do
gets
not-
rezoned?
I do not want to say.
You're going to go on record with that?
I am going to go
Yes.
on record.
That is
I'm trying to,
Courageous.
next, behind Stickenstein, the moose is my second target.
Actually, I do have a question. We've been dancing around these caretaker units in Smoky Hollow, and are those part of this equation at all?
It's a good question. I think that you have to probably ask that question when we bring it to you as a study session next month, tentatively?
December.
December. But I think as we look at these specific plans in general, and we continue to look at our development standards in general, zoning standards, that we have to start asking ourselves that question, and not just specific to Smoky Hollow, but the downtown specific plan and you know, multifamily zones as a whole.
And just to be clear, anybody could propose a project that's not on the site inventory list, and we still get full credit for
Right.
that. It's just production. So we're not limited to these areas.
Right, this is just to demonstrate capacity to the state.
That's a great point, Michelle.
I mean, because some of my concern is that we've done this, but is it addressing the needs of our community? There's no, we need for sale housing at lower price points. This is not going to do that, I don't think, unless somebody wants to build condos and make a couple affordable.
Right.
Well, they could use this overlay to build condos, and none of them be affordable, right?
Yes.
You could take an apartment and make it condos, or,
Mm-hmm.
like, to his point, we're just saying, here's how you would zone it and put all the density, and here's where it would go.
Yeah.
I mean, I do want to commend you guys for trying as best you could to isolate the density to the R3 and R2 zone, which is, I think, where it belongs. So thank you for that.
For purposes of the record, I'm gonna say, instead of isolating, we expanded into other portions of the city, the opportunity areas, for housing development.
Much better put. Much better put. Yeah.
Yes, and that will be reflected in the minutes.
Okay, if there aren't any other further discussions on this item, I will take a motion for, what are we doing, approving this?
Yeah, this is a recommendation to city council.
Okay, well, let me make the motion to recommend approval with the modifications discussed to the resolution. And can I get a second for that?
I'll second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, 3-0. Thank you. Thank you all for your work on that fun project. I look forward to it in 8 more years, huh? We'll do it again. Can't wait.
We only have 6 at this point.
Oh,
3 years behind.
take the fun out of the room, why don't you? All right, next, new public hearing, agenda item H3. We're talking about a zone text amendment to permanently allow and regulate home sharing. And can we have a staff report, please?
While Eduardo's getting set up, Veronica's still there. I just want to acknowledge Veronica and Jamie who were on the call. I don't know if they still are, but they've worked tirelessly with staff, and we really owe a huge amount of gratitude to them. And so we thank them, and they're not going away. We're gonna use a lot more of their time, but just thank you, Veronica and Jamie.
Thanks, Veronica. Thanks, Jamie.
Okay, so we are back again to discuss short-term rentals or home sharing more specifically. There's a long track history, as you can kind of see here. I just kind of put some bullet points, dates together in terms of when we broached a subject with the commission and council over the years. It started back in 2017, where I think there were a group of residents that kind of approached the city council and kind of set the ball in motion to look at short-term rentals. That was around the same time that, other cities were also struggling with the surge in short-term rentals, and there wasn't really any hard and fast rules. There was a lot of media outlets that were reporting party houses. Obviously, we in our little town here experienced some of the negative impacts of short-term rentals. That led to an ordinance for large gatherings and party houses, and the Planning Commission took stabs at it and made some recommendations to the City Council over the years. Some that included, yes, let's regulate short-term rentals, to the other side of the spectrum of no, let's just ban them. And there was a lot of back and forth, as you could see over the years, to where it finally landed in 2020. After really hearing a lot of public input, from at the council level when it got to them, and ultimately they found that a large percentage of the folks that were speaking to to the council and to the commission as well, they realized that those who were conducting this, albeit not in the most legal of fashion, were, you know, those who were doing it were as a home share, where they were on site, you know, people in the neighborhoods really didn't even really know that it was going on, and really found that the ones that were becoming issues and problems were the ones where it was whole house, where the property owner was absent. And so the council kind of felt, you know, let's balance this and see, let's give it a try, let's give it a shot and see where we can land on with respect to, maybe going with a permanent home share type of process. And so they decided ultimately in July of 2020 to proceed with a pilot program. Of course, we were in the midst of COVID, and so the implementation of that pilot program, was halted for quite a bit of time. But anyhow, the whole background or the whole point of the home share was to ultimately allow for the renting, and this is straight from the definition of the code, is to allow for short-term rentals of a portion of someone's property, provided that it's their primary residence, that it's the property owner while the host lives there. And so that was something that the council said, let's move forward with this, let's do a trial run. And so we started implementing that back in October of last year after the COVID restrictions were lifted and loosened. So we've been doing that, and so we've been monitoring, et cetera, but it all started back officially last October 1st. And so to take you a little bit through the process in terms of what applicants would go through is we developed a home share permit application along with a business license we didn't create the business license, but the home share permit application, we created that. And so the process involved the applicant submitting that application along with their business license through our finance department. We in planning, we would go ahead and verify that information with regards to the home ownership. There was certain documentation that the property owner would have to submit to establish that it is their primary residence, one of the requirements of this program. So once that was verified, we would go ahead and approve the short-term home share permit. Finance would take care of the business licensing portion, wrap that up with a nice bow, and submit or give that back to the applicant, and they would go ahead and also assist them with the collection or establishing the TOT issue. So once the permits were approved, we as staff, we kept kind of a registry, if you will, so that we can keep tabs on that. That was shared with our folks in neighborhood preservation, code enforcement, and PD. And what we just kind of waited and monitored, and if there were any complaints or violations, we would respond to those accordingly. So we also, during the pilot program period, which officially ends at the end of this year, by the way, we had embarked upon the services of a short-term rental company vendor to help us kind of monitor some of these sites, because there's the number of sites out there where one could use as a platform to advertise is so numerous. So, but they helped us out a little bit. It wasn't ideal in terms of ultimately what we had expected, but it did the job to help us through and get us, to the point of really establishing and monitoring these sites and monitoring these listings. During this time, we also had some communication with Airbnb, which actually helped us here in El Segundo a little bit by pushing out information to their hosts who were putting listings on there that were technically not allowed, and so they worked with us to push that information out to their hosts, and we actually had the ability to take down any kind of lingering listings, and at least on their platform. So they've been pretty helpful with staff and open to at least helping us address some of those problems, but they really didn't escalate to a whole lot, which was great. So anyhow, so we'd monitor that, and again, like I said, the permits do expire at the end of the pilot program, which, as I indicated, ran from October 1st through the end of this year. So at this point, someone could reapply if the program is allowed. So anyhow, to give you a little bit of context, there were a total of 20 home shares that were issued and permitted throughout town. The dots in red show the location of each of those. And as you can see here, I mean, they're not really concentrated in one area. Obviously they're going to be in the residential zones because that is where they are allowed. So there wasn't really any kind of concentration, and even so, there might be, I guess you could kind of classify the southwest area as maybe a small cluster, but again, even though there were, that may be considered a cluster, it's kind of in the R3 zone. What we found with these at the end was that, of these 20 homes, there weren't any violations or any calls for services or complaints that we received in terms, from our code enforcement folks to our PD. So that was a good thing. That was a very good indicator that these home shares aren't becoming a problem or were not a problem. The average nightly stays per booking were 2.5 nights. I know that kind of sounds a little bit odd, but on average, they were about 2.5 nights. And then the projected revenue by the end of the year, at the end of the pilot program, we're estimating roughly about $52,000 in fees, which includes TOT, business license, and home share permit fees. So combined, we made out with we presume to be making out for about $52,000. Host compliance, which had assisted us, even if you were to deduct what we spent on them, which was roughly about $16,000, we still net, hate to say a profit, but it nets, more money in terms of what the revenues that we took in. So what else did we find in terms of over the pilot program period? We did find that obviously there were numerous listings out there, and it's really important distinction to make that distinction between listings and properties, because there could be, at some time, excuse me, at some times there was upwards of 160, 180 listings out there, but that doesn't mean that there's 180 properties out there that are actually doing this. But there were many listings out there, which kind of narrowed down once you looked at the number of properties. It was maybe about half of that. But over the course of time, we did see a decrease in the number of non-compliant listings out there. And that also was aided by by Airbnb pushing that information out. Some of the things that people have done, though, they kind of skirt the system, if you will, and that's something that's going to happen. I think we all need to acknowledge that in some form or fashion. Is they'll advertise for more than 30 days. So technically, that's not considered a short-term rental. And then there's other things like, for example, like indicate here, vampire listings, where they'll put up a listing at 2 in the morning and to maybe take it down an hour later, and the whole point of that is to try to avoid detection from either the monitoring companies or from city staff. But of course they call them like vampire listings because they try to do that during the off hours where they know code enforcement staff is not monitoring.
And is the point of that they hope someone will book that during that time?
Well, yeah, because you figure, I mean, these platforms that they're advertising, it's worldwide, so it may be 3 in the morning here, but it's, maybe lunchtime in London or something like that, and someone who wants to come out here sees that booking or listing and can book it immediately. So, but anyhow, so if this program does continue, or even if it doesn't, we'll continue to monitor, for any unpermitted listings and whole house short-term rentals, and then follow up with, appropriate action, whether it be through, revocation, if that's the process that ultimately gets approved, or we go through, citations, which is also another option as well. So anyhow, with that, staff does recommend that you adopt the resolution recommending that city council adopt an ordinance to, in essence, permanently allow for a short-term home sharing through the short-term home sharing permit process.
All right, thank you, Eduardo. One of the email comments we had from a resident who's doing, well, first I should say all the email comments were in favor of us adopting this. One of them asked if there was a way we could get Airbnb to collect the TOT tax to make their lives easier. Is that something we can look into?
Yes, our finance staff is looking, or is in the process of working with them to do that. They just find that it's true, does make it a lot easier because they have the resources to just collect everything all at once and remit that to the
So
city.
the homeowner would get their rentals and the city would just get the TOT tax and,
Exactly, yes.
all right, any other questions? Okay, now's the time for public communication. Anyone wanting to make any public comments? Pretty please? All right, I'll close public communication, no rush to the dais, as Wagner used to like to say. I'll go ahead and close public communication. All other,
Mr. Chair, if I may, I do have some minor modifications to the text of the ordinance that you'll be recommending.
all right, let's pull it up.
And
Can you give me a page you're on?
I'm actually looking at the existing ordinance. So what is baked into the publication has elements that are being modified. So I will refer to the actual chapter, but most of these are low-hanging fruits. So let me just start. The easiest one comes first. It's removing pilot from the name of the chapter, home sharing permit pilot program. We'll take out pilot. There is an existing section 4-16-7, conditions of permit issuance and operational conditions. There are two subsections there that talk about home sharing in the R2 zone and the R3 zone. My proposal is to marry those into one section and also include R1 because it's R1, R2, R3. So it's a little cleanup, just to make sure we're covering that. Finally, in section 4-16-1, there is a current reference to revocation upon 2 violations of the chapter, and it says that your permit gets revoked and you can't have another permit issued during the duration of the pilot program. So it's tethered to the pilot program. So the question here is, do we want to just require them to have a waiting period where they sit out for a year if they do have revocation? And then, so there's some, if there's either the earlier of 1 year or a change in ownership, then the property owner can reapply following this revocation. So it's basically a question of timing and
And the revocation is basically someone's been doing a home share and they don't have a permit.
so that could be one of the 2 violations that would trigger the revocation. So it could be that they aren't using it as a primary residence or any of the conditions that would apply, which are numerous. So for any of those 2, most commonly you would think that they're renting without or advertising without a permit. Then if they do have a permit, it would be revoked. And so right now, they can't reapply until for the duration of the pilot program. So given the possibility that it might be becoming a permanent program, how long do we want to have people sit out, so to speak?
And does a nuisance complaint also trigger that?
So that's a great question. There's a separate section saying that you're subject to nuisance enforcement, but it doesn't say if if you are found guilty of a nuisance, then that would necessarily trigger revocation. There is a provision that says if the site is found to be loud or unruly, which leads to an administrative citation or criminal charge, which could be done under nuisance, then it's revoked. And this sort of party house enforcement section for revocation, along with the 2 strikes and you're out, 2 violations and you're revoked, those two, I think we should have a common revisit on when the property owner may reapply. There's no requirement that you allow them to. We could just say, hey, you had your shot. But we may want to have it to where, at the very least, if there's a new property owner, if there's a change in ownership, then you at least give that new property owner the benefit of the doubt. That could be one, or you could pair that with you sit out for a year, you sit out for 2 years, some kind of waiting period before they can, have a timeout and think about what they did.
I would argue that we should have a short waiting period because from what I get from the people who've written in, like they need this income.
Mm-hmm.
So to say you can't, you violated some administrative rule, you didn't get a permit, people make mistakes. I would hate for someone to be put in financial hardship for a year or 6 months.
And this would be someone who already has it. So, so if you're renting without a permit, you don't have a permit to revoke. But I see your point.
Right,
Yeah, I mean, if it's a fix-it ticket, that's one thing.
right.
If it's something, oh, I made a mistake, let me fix that, and then
But I think
you're back
this is
in.
just saying, you violate, you get revoked.
Correct.
So it's kind of draconian of, you may lose, some income here.
Right.
If you don't do it right.
Right.
So I get the idea of you get a timeout, but I don't want it to be, too
Onerous.
onerous to where we're putting
Do you
someone
want
in
to say
financial
180
distress.
days, 6 months, in other words?
Like 3 months, maybe?
Sure.
But
Okay.
then if you've got a repeat offender, I think there should be discretion of the department to be like,
Sure.
how many
yeah.
times do you keep reapplying for the same permit?
Yeah, and if we do
But
go.
isn't that part of the permit process of, have you had violations? Have you had noise ordinances? Or is it just the permit process, just where do you live and?
So a lot of those gaps get filled in through the administrative guidelines that the ordinance allows to be promulgated. So that's one way to cover that. But I think staff does ask some of those questions in the application process.
Yeah, we work closely with our code enforcement staff to see if there's anything, egregious or any complaints that are not just complaints, but actually verified and led to some sort of action. And then, our colleagues over in PD to see if there's any service calls as well.
And if we do have any, a particularly problematic property owner through the judicial process, through nuisance, there might be additional enforcement that a judge may sign off on. If we're having like a party house that's just constantly a problem, we could get an injunction from.
Right, that's separate and apart from the permitting system.
Mhm.
Okay. So yeah, thoughts on that?
I mean, I agree with the timeout. No problem with 3 months. It would be, I think, a nuisance would be more of an issue for me than a permit violation, I guess.
Yeah, but we have I don't know what it's called, the home social host ordinance. So there's other avenues. If there are noise complaints, the city can send police officers out there to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, 30 days or 60 days, 3
3 months?
months, 90 days?
90 days?
Sure.
90 days. All right, we'll do 3 months, Joaquin. Does that work?
That works. And that's all I got. Thank you.
All right.
And also, I think, that sends a message, a good message, because from what I gather from speaking with hosts is that, especially when this is coming, to an end, a lot of them were like, well, what's going to happen? Because, we have, bookings or reservations that push into the new year. And we need to know whether this is good. So this is good for them to be on notice and helps keep them on track, because that way, they don't want to forego that having to reimburse someone for a booking that they have to ultimately cancel.
And can we make sure that if this is approved by city council, we give notice to all permit holders? Here's how you reapply, it's been
Yes.
renewed,
Yes.
this is what you need to do? Okay.
Definitely, yes. And I had sent them notice as well of tonight's meeting, along with everyone that had attended, that I had emails for the previous, umpteenth, meetings.
Got it.
One last thing that I want to also just note is that although, this is staff, recommendation, the other caveat to that, or the other, issue is short-term rentals as a whole, or for a whole house. And that's something, whether you want to start tackling that, or if you just don't even want to get into that, it'll still be prohibited feature. And, that's up to you if you guys want to give us any direction on that, or if you have any questions in terms of how that would work.
Have you had
That's not
anybody come
agendized
in?
for tonight, though, right?
It was agendized for discussion.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just discussion, this part.
Have you had anybody come in and ask for that and been told, no, we only do home share, not?
Yes, we have had quite a few calls and inquiries about that, about having whole house.
So discussion that does that,
If-
what then?
Well,
I
Just
think,
taking our
I think we're just
temperature?
mainly seeing, temperature check.
Yeah,
If there's
see
a
if there's
desire.
appetite to discuss, right?
We haven't, we're not getting hounded every day.
no.
But there are inquiries, and it was a subject of discussion when this first came to the city a couple of years ago.
Oh, yeah. The history of this was, we had to deal with the Airbnbs because there was a handful of homes that were having parties. And then through the process we went through, it got separated to Airbnbs aren't the issue, it's just these party houses. So we have this social host ordinance that wasn't in play back then. We have had taken one resident to court over the nuisance. So people should know that the city has means within its control to coerce people to behave. So I would not be opposed to doing a pilot program on full home, right? Just like we did with this one. People come in and get a permits, and then we'll find out if we're having problems, because I thought that's why we separated the noise host ordinance from rentals, because we thought there were two distinct things. So either we have a host ordinance that will stop party houses, but yeah, I'm not opposed. I mean, to me, does it make a difference? As long as the neighbors are not impacted, and maybe there is a fundamental difference when the host is on site, that people behave a lot better.
Yeah, and I think that that was kind of the distinction made during city council when they ultimately approved this, was they found that, like I had indicated earlier, was that, the folks that did come out and speak on behalf of their experiences, they found real quickly that the negative experiences were with the whole house, owners not there.
Yeah,
And
if we did this, I would want to put a limitation on how many weeks, because we don't want to have someone who is, leasing a house, and we have this, someone would lease a house and then they would just use it for Airbnb rentals. So that's a house that's no longer being used for someone to move to town. It's just a business opportunity for somebody.
Well, it's still the same thing, right? We would say it has to be your primary. You are the primary owner.
Primary,
Well, as opposed to an investor
Correct.
that comes in and.
right, but then if they're primary, but they Airbnb it 8 months of the year, right? I'm thinking more of the family that would use this once a year when they're out of, maybe they go away for the summer or whatever it is. Like, I can see that working, but I want to avoid the situation where someone is like, I'm going to make money doing Airbnbs, whole house Airbnbs.
yeah, and that's really tough to really come up with those types of regulations, because I mean, quite honestly, colleagues in other cities have tried to tackle it in different ways, and it's just becomes really an enforcement and trying to issue and trying to chase
Yeah, that's
down
true.
these things. And quite honestly, I think from a staff perspective, and I understand wholeheartedly, and I respect your desire to potentially check it out through a pilot program period. I think what ultimately happens with that, especially with some of the negative experiences that some of the community members have had, and we always hear how long it took. And it does take a long time because there's that process. I think from a planning standpoint, looking at this, if you added a short-term rental permit process to that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joaquin, is if there are violations, you first have to go through and revoke their permit first before you can then actually go into trying to shut them down. So we're almost creating an additional barrier, if you will, to actually shutting down a whole house short-term rental by creating a short-term rental permit process.
Well, the
So
permit
just something to
process would
consider.
allow us to take away permits from bad actors.
Correct.
You're just saying if someone is in violation of the rules we set, we'd have to take away the permit and then we'd prosecute them in the normal course.
Right, and just the revocation process itself could be prolonged as well, because, they have appeal rights, so we'd have to advertise, we'd have to come before you, you'd have to revoke it, and then they could then in turn appeal that decision to the council. So now you're looking 3, 4, 5 months later until it gets to the council says, yeah, you're right, we're gonna revoke it. Okay, so it gets revoked, they continue to do it, and now we're 4 or 5 months later, we're gonna start the whole process that we did with like the other bad actors. So I just think it almost handcuffs ourselves, we potentially handcuffing ourselves to just prolonging shutting a bad actor down if we were to implement that.
But honestly, that would be the case anyway. Even if there's not a permit and someone is creating a nuisance, that's 2.5 years of, bureaucratic paperwork and litigation on top of it. Right, Joaquin? I mean, the last time we did it, it was not quick and easy, and we went right up to trial with this woman.
That's true.
So I get what you're saying.
Yeah. But then you have to have that
I don't want to
notification
take
process up front.
I don't want to take a property right away from
Yeah.
everybody because it'll be hard for us to go after the bad guys, right? So I'm open to a discussion about having a pilot program with some limitations of it's your primary residence and a limitation of how many weeks it can be rented out.
Beyond just not it being a 30-day, because that already is in existence.
Yeah, you can rent for 60 days, no problem. So it's just the Airbnb stuff.
I think there's two things that inform this. One is, as the primary residence, the owner, who must be a natural person, must live there for 183, so just slightly over 50% of the year. And then on top of that, they have to be on site during the rental. So it's not only like where if you're on vacation, you're gonna rent it out. Like you need to be on site for the home sharing to be home sharing by definition under this.
Well, no, we're talking now about full house rental.
Right. I just wanted to clarify, like, what this requires as opposed to you're not on site, and maybe, when you are doing a family vacation around Europe, that gives you the opportunity to then rent your house for whatever maybe pilot duration, short duration period that might be.
Right. Short-term rental, when the property owner isn't there. Yeah, I mean, why, outside of the problems that we all know intimately about, why are we saying no? If we think we have a party house ordinance that's gonna take care of loud noises, then I guess why wouldn't we do a pilot program and see if these are terrible for our community? Maybe they're not. I mean, we had plenty of people come and testify about how it's worked for them and they have not had any problems. It's just the ones that did have problems were extremely vocal about it. And I would get it. No one wants to live next door to that on a Tuesday
Nope.
night.
And I will tell you, people are very happy with that ordinance. I mean,
That it was shut down.
yes, very happy.
Yeah.
So what are your guys' thoughts? Is it worth exploring or?
I certainly think that.
Or should we wait until there's a public uproar saying they want this?
Yeah, well,
I mean, I guess that's the other thing, right? Does anybody
want to go
come
through that
and
again?
ask it to be on the agenda? But I don't have any problem with a pilot program.
Well, I guess just looking at the business at hand, I certainly think that we should recommend continuing, not the pilot program, but making the home share thing a permanent thing. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
Agreed.
it sounds like that.
I think we
just,
have consensus on that.
that's no problem at all.
So should we just approve that and then have the discussion? Let me read my agenda. What are we
And,
talking
and
about?
approval with the modifications to
modified
the
by
ordinance?
council.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let me go ahead and make that. I'll make a motion to approve, to permanently allow home sharing as modified by our city attorney. And can I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
And now let's continue with our discussion item of,
Whole house.
yeah, where is it on the agenda?
The planning commission will also discuss
Okay.
whole house,
Thanks.
short-term rentals. So, you know, I'm personally torn. I mean, I'm an Airbnb user. I'll bet my company uses 30 days a year of whole house. We would probably never book a home share, but, you know, we're good people, and my company, and, you know, we always get great reviews. So I know that it works very well when everybody behaves themselves.
Right.
And that's the problem. We have,
Right.
you know,
Sure.
what percentage of people behaving themselves is appropriate, or rather, what percentage of people misbehaving is acceptable? And if the
Well, I think that number is 0, but the question is, do we have other regulations on the books that we can use to enforce bad actors, separate and apart from the rental part of it?
right, well, of course, and as I think as we saw last time, even those other mechanisms don't necessarily work very quickly.
Yeah,
You
Yeah.
know, so how many instances of, you know, someone has a bachelorette party, and, you know, they're good girls, but they're loud, and it's, you know, 3 in the morning, and the neighbor next door is annoyed and makes the call. You know, that's gonna happen. And so, how many of those do you get away with?
right. Well, we could put that in there, like a service call is the grounds for revocation of your permit, or how many service
Yeah,
calls.
how many service
right?
calls? Yeah.
I mean, is there a way for staff to, when the police get called for a nuisance, is there a way for them to report that? I don't want to create more work for you then. Because I
Yeah.
already know, like, when we say you can only be there so many days, like, none of this is getting enforced. I don't expect you to knock on a door and, you know, is Mr. Jones home?
Yeah.
I think Michael will send me at, 2 in the morning to go knock on doors.
But
Well,
would
we'll
there
send
be
us
an
that.
easy way for staff to find out if there have been nuisance calls?
Yeah, I mean, we can most definitely reach out to, at any time to our colleagues in PD. Sometimes I think what we found is, they'll report, or they'll go to a particular site and see, okay, just everyone kind of dispersed. And, it's a call, but ultimately it wasn't considered a violation in the eyes of the officer.
Yeah,
who's
they go
out
get a
there.
warning.
Right, so the community sees it as a violation because they experienced that negative, they had that negative experience, but, did it rise to the level of being an actual, violation? At that point, there's nothing that we could say, yeah, it is a violation, so it could potentially keep going on and on. So, yeah, that's.
If there were, if we did a pilot program and there were certain houses that had a history of, just acting poorly again.
Yeah, that would
and
be
again.
on the application.
Exactly, would those
They would be
be
disqualified.
flagged and be disqualified? And so I think that would help. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not gonna happen someplace else, but at
Right,
least.
right. So, Michelle, are you on board in general terms about a pilot program?
I am, yeah. I mean, I remember this was, I think, my first contentious planning meeting in my history, the longest one we
Oh,
had.
memories.
And I was supportive of full home at the time,
Mm-hmm.
but we didn't have the party house, or it wasn't secure then, so
Well, why don't I propose this? Instead of making staff work something up, can you just convey to council that we had this discussion and the commission is open to a pilot program for home share with the restrictions we discussed about, prior violations means you can't apply and you get your permit revoked if there's calls, all these things we're talking about. You have to, primary residence and a limit on the amount of time, and just kind of check the pulse of council, because if they say no, then I want you guys to work up a big
Understood.
report that's
No,
not gonna make it past this
Yeah.
dais anyway. That sound good?
Yeah.
We got it.
All right. So that's it for agenda item H3. Next is new business, where I have a discussion about R3 development potential update and discussion item.
Thank you, Chair. And while we get our consultants up, a minor refresher. The LEAP grant, which is a local early action planning grant issued by the state. Previously, this came to you in the fashion of a form of an inclusionary housing study. When the similar presentation was made to City Council, we shifted gears to refocus the study on a earlier study that some of the commission members participated in several years ago, looking at the type of density it would take on a couple of properties in the R3 zone in order to incentivize redevelopment. That study never completed, and so we picked up where we left off, and EPS, Economic and Planning Systems, and specifically Darren and Rod on the call here with us, came up with the memorandum that you have as an attachment to daylight and outline the findings and outcome of that study, which you've already seen as a part of our previous conversation with the housing element, resulted in specific numbers that we used in our housing element. And so tonight they'll help us understand how we arrived at those numbers, and then we can talk about next steps a little bit. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Darren and Rod.
Good evening. Thank you for having us. Again, I'm Darren Smith, a managing principal with the consulting firm of Economic and Planning Systems, and with me is Roderick Hall. And we will be running through some material that we have prepared for you regarding the potential upzoning of R3. And I just want to start by saying that it is, of course, timely. Some of the things that you were discussing earlier this evening with your other consultant, Veronica Tam, are absolutely related to the work that we've been doing. And so I was pleased to hear that commentary that you've already been thinking about this. And so we'll dive right in. With that, I will start sharing my screen and hope that this works well. All right. Is everyone seeing this?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. So again, Darren Smith and Roderick Hall from Economic and Planning Systems. So a little bit of background. We were hired to help the city to promote redevelopment and production of new housing in the city, and in particular, in this case, to look at the potential for upzoning the R3 properties. And we've used a study area that is not all of the R3 properties in the city, but a concentration of them as a source of reference here for conducting our analysis. We look at the economic implications of that upzoning and what it might take to incentivize production of new housing in those areas. We look at the potential for replacement. Michael Allen was speaking earlier about the requirements to accommodate the lower income households that are already on the site. If you are going to redevelop existing housing, state law SB 330 has pretty specific specifications about how you would go about doing that, especially about replacing those units that otherwise are occupied or have been occupied by lower income households. And finally, we have some thoughts about what development regulations might need to change in your current R3 zoning to accommodate the levels of density and other physical characteristics that might be required to address this rezoning criteria. So a little bit of background again, SB 330, this was adopted in 2019, also known as the Housing Crisis Act of 2019. And it really is intended, among other things, to limit the demolition of lower cost and rent stabilized apartments by requiring several things. One of them is one-for-one replacement of any units that are demolished or redeveloped, and replacing those at comparable affordability. So if you are a household, a lower income household, whether or not you have been paying below market rate rents is actually beside the point in this case. If you're a lower income household, then and you are displaced through this redevelopment, the new developer is required to provide a unit for each of those households that have been displaced. The developer is also required to provide monetary assistance to any displaced tenants. So if you buy an apartment building and are going to redevelop it and you have to move people out, the developer is required to provide, I believe it's 42 months, 3.5 years. Is that correct, Rob? Yes, 42 months. So 3.5 years of rent support for those households, and then give those same households the opportunity to move back into the project once it's completed. So fairly stringent, and does create the intended effect of having a disincentive for the displacement of existing units. Now, in the case of the R3 properties in El Segundo, that means that it is a financial hardship to consider redeveloping those existing units, and we have tried to factor that into our analysis.
Well, can I ask, when you're saying low income,
Yes,
we're not talking about units that have already been designated as affordable housing, right?
that's correct. Whether
These are
they
just-
are deed restricted affordable housing or under rent control, or even simply occupied by a household that qualifies as a low income household, that is occupied by one or has been occupied by a household that it earns less than 80% of median income anytime in the last 5 years. That's what the law says, that those units are subject to the replacement requirements. So
Okay.
again, fairly stringent. It doesn't just apply to deed restricted affordable housing. It applies to any unit that is or was occupied recently by a household earning less than 80% of median income.
I don't think we have any deed restricted affordable housing.
No, not at this time.
Not at this time.
Yeah.
I think that's correct, but you
No,
absolutely
There's
have
no
have
El Segundo
units that
City
are,
rent control.
occupied by lower income households.
Yeah, there's not, but to Darren's point, you don't have to be deed restricted.
It's just if someone-
If you meet the income qualifying criteria and your rent, or I'm sorry, if your rent meets the affordable rate, then you're subject, or that is considered a protected unit.
So, as an example, if there's a senior citizen who's living in an older apartment, has been there for a long time and is paying below market, if a developer wanted to come in, they would have to help relocate and provide housing for that
That's
person.
correct.
Okay, that makes sense.
Is that true for Section 8 as well? And I don't know that we have any Section 8 here.
Yeah, I don't think we do.
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
Yes, and just to clarify the point, I believe was Michael making it, it is not just whether they paid less than market rate, it is even if they were paying market rate, if their income as a household, it qualifies as 80% or lower than median, they are subject to the replacement, even if they were in a market rate unit. So again, the intention of this law was to stop lower income households from being displaced through redevelopment of properties. And it does a very good job of that because it creates a strong disincentive for redevelopment because it really restricts the incomes that future units can get. So we wanted to talk a little bit about existing conditions. Again, we've got a study area here that doesn't represent all of your R3, but it is a concentration of R3 zoning that goes from Sycamore to the north down to Holly on the south and Washington to the west over to Pacific Coast Highway on the east. There's 74 different parcels in those couple of blocks, comprising 18 total acres of land, on which there are 577 existing multifamily units. Interestingly, your R3 right now allows a density not greater than 27 units per acre. These properties actually are already built as existing at an average of 32 units per acre. So they are zoned R3, but actually as a group exceed the current limit on R3 density. So we found that interesting. Also, just by point of reference, the census indicates that there has been relatively little housing built in El Segundo in recent years. Only 1% or so of the city's overall stock was built after 2010. This is not news to you. It's a largely built out city. But just another indicator of the difficulty from a market perspective and a physical perspective of getting housing going in El Segundo. And just by point of reference, we have a couple of street view images of the study area, one looking up Indiana Court, another Maple Avenue at the intersection with Indiana Court. Primarily here, we're talking about the R3s representing 1 and 2 story multifamily buildings. Not particularly dense at that 27, 32 units per acre, a fair amount of lawn space, relatively low buildings. The height limit is 32 feet under current R3 regulations. So relatively low buildings, even if it is among your highest density housing in the city right now. So anytime we're doing analysis of redevelopment potential, the first thing we need to consider is what is the value of the thing as it exists now. And so to look at that, we take in mind that these are properties that are providing cash flow for their owners. And if a developer were interested in redeveloping these properties, they would need to pay those current owners more than the value of the units as they exist right now. Otherwise, the current owners would not have an incentive to sell. They would simply keep making that income more or less in perpetuity as long as the buildings themselves are in decent shape. So this is an example of how we do that analysis. Right now, in that study area, the average rent per unit per month is around $2,200, according to CoStar data. That's the equivalent of about $26,000 a year, and at a industry standard, 35% of income going toward operating expenses and vacancy losses, you get to a net operating income for a given unit at an estimated $17,160 a year. Now, the way that the market would value such a unit that's producing $17,000 of income every year is to use a capitalization rate that converts that 1 year income into an overall value. So at the going rate of a little over 4% capitalization rate, we are estimating that these units are worth on average about $400,000 if developer or to the existing property owners, or even to a future buyer who doesn't want to redevelop them, just wants that same income for themselves. So at 32 units per acre and $400,000 per unit, that sums to about the equivalent of about $12.9 million per acre is the existing value. And so that's the floor against which we have to compare the value that is created through new development to be sure that it is feasible for a future developer to come in and buy a property for redevelopment, have to tear down the existing units and build a brand new building at higher density, presumably. They need to get a residual land value, and Rod will talk about what that means. They need to get a residual land value that exceeds the existing value of the units at $12.9 million. And with that, I will turn it over to Rod, but I'll keep running the show.
Perfect. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you, Darren, for the intro as it relates to estimating the existing value of the study area. What we ended up doing from there, as you can see on this table, is we took that existing value and modeled it in 5 different scenarios. The key distinction in each scenario is not in the existing value of the units in the study area, it's in the replacement requirements as they have been modeled. It's important to note that scenario 2 which has a 25% replacement requirement. It's also that rebuttable presumption requirement that was discussed earlier in the presentation. As it was already noted, the city does not have any deed restricted affordable housing. And so the approach that we took in our modeling was to look at the share of very low income renters and low income renters. That was 13% and 12% respectively. And that ended up totaling to a 25% replacement requirement. And what you see here on this slide is that we are summarizing the parameters of the replacement scenarios and the required density for upzoning based on the total units that have to be replaced. So under scenario 1, for instance, with no replacement requirements, we estimate that rezoning would need to be around 68 units per acre, which might be sufficient for some properties. There's always going to be caveats due to parcel size, among other factors. And then from there, we estimate that density goes up quickly to 78, 93, 108, and 123 units per acre under the remaining scenarios. And so what we end up doing, of course, is looking at the residual land value, which ends up being the project value minus cost. In order for the current landowner to be incentivized to sell the property for redevelopment, the residual land value must exceed that 12.9 million acre or $12.9 million per acre that we estimated. And so again, the important thing to understand here is that the market rate units had the same rent across the board. Where things ended up differing as it relates to this particular point is that the more affordable units that are required, the less the project is likely to pencil out without some sort of density increase. So again, with 8 units required for affordable housing total, you see that there's about 77 units needed per acre to achieve that to achieve that 12.9 million. And then on the other hand, as I've mentioned, it goes up because the developer is not earning the same amount as they would have had the project been 100% market rate. So they're looking to recover those costs in some way, shape, or form. And the approach in this case is to allow more market rate to be built. And so going from there, we understand, you can go to the next slide, Darren.
Actually, Rod, if you don't mind, I realized that I forgot to adequately introduce this rebuttable presumption concept specifically. So what that means is under SB 330, what you are required to do, if you know who lived in the building or who lives in the building, their incomes, then you are required to meet the replacement requirements that correspond to the actual tenants of the building. If you don't know who the current tenants are or were, then you have the opportunity to use what's called the rebuttable presumption, where you look at census data that tells you overall in the city what proportion of renters fall under these low income and very low income categories, and that becomes the standard for a given building. So every building is expected to have some kind of replacement requirement. In the scenarios that are on the screen right now, the first scenario would apply to a building only if someone literally knows that no one who currently lives in the building or has lived in the building in the last 5 years qualified as a low-income household, which seems unlikely. So most of the buildings subject to this redevelopment would be subject to, at a minimum, that 25% replacement requirement that is the rebuttable presumption under SB 330. And it can go up from there if there is information that shows that, for example, all of the tenants in the building are or have been lower income households. Then you're into the fifth scenario here, where you need to replace, in this case, we're assuming a 1 acre property, you need to replace all 32 existing units. at low or very low income, and therefore need another 85 market rate units in order to make this project pencil. So sorry I missed that note, and with that I will proceed to the next slide.
Thank you. So we recognize that seeing numbers and trying to estimate how that looks in the built environment can be quite the hassle. So we wanted to make it a little bit fun and show some examples of the different densities that we modeled, the different densities required to make the projects pencil out. And so what I'll note is 3 of the 4 images in front of you are based in the Southern California market. And then 1 image is based in a non-Southern California market, more specifically a non-LA market. And so if you can just hit the next arrow, Darren, each one will come up. So the first one you see here is Missouri Place. That's located in the city of LA. And this is a project at 137 dwelling units per acre. The next project.
And real quickly on this one, this is what's called a 5/2 building. It's got 5 stories of wood frame construction over a 2-story parking garage. And so that achieves 137 units per acre in this case. And probably has a height of about 85 feet.
Perfect, thanks. The next is in Playa Vista. It's a development project named Waterstone, and this is about 69 dwelling units per acre. Unlike the project before this only has one story of parking underneath compared to what Darren just showed. The next set of apartments, the first one is going to be in Seattle, Washington. This is 205 dwelling units per acre. Recognize that number is high. However, we thought it was important to show that a high number does not always equal to a lot of height. As you can see here, this development project is not sky high. However, it is achieving a high number of dwelling units per acre. And then the last project is in Playa Vista as well, and it's called the Pacific Promenade. This project is about 99 dwelling units per acre, and again, not high in height requirements either. And so this is probably one of, I would say that all the slides here are important, but the importance of this slide is that upzoning land is only one component of development feasibility. Parcels of land all may be zoned for the same use, such as in this case R3. However, they're not always the same size or shape. And so what that means is that there may need to be regulation changes made in other areas to ensure projects can continue to pencil out. I'm not going to go through every single one of the regulations here. However, you can see they cover a wide array of topics from lot area to density to minimum or maximum unit sizes to parking. And as you all are well aware of the current standards, you can see from there what potential changes may be, though we're not saying that they are required. So for instance, with the lot area, you can see that the current standard in the city is 7,000 square feet at a minimum. And so one potential change to ensure the project pencils out is to increase the minimum lot size for projects being developed at a higher density. However, you may have another situation where the lot coverage is increased. And so instead of 53% of the area of the lot being covered, you can increase that to 85% of the lot area. And what that will allow is, instead of a project that continues to go up, there is a project that, or I should say, that could go vertical. There is a project that could be built out in a more horizontal fashion, thus maybe requiring the 85-foot max height requirement to not have to go as high. If, of course, the Planning Commission and City Council is looking to find that balance between height restrictions and lot coverage. And then, of course, I want to make sure I note that there's changes among the many changes that the state is making, as has already been discussed as it relates to the housing element, are also changes around parking requirements. I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Darren, that within half a mile radius of transit, parking requirements are no longer required for development projects. That, of course, is going to continue to help with projects penciling out, though, of course, that's not the only approach the city could take. There could be alternative parking standards as well. And so I'll stop there and see if you have anything you want to add to this slide, Darren, before we move into the discussion.
No, I think that's good, Rod. Thank you. I do want to go back and just taking a look at this slide and seeing that, to get the maximum densities that we're talking about for feasibility, that again is contingent on the level of replacement that is required for a given property. We are talking about potentially going up to 85 feet maximum height, which is nearly triple the existing height limit. We're talking about going potentially up to 120 units to the acre, which is about 5 times the existing height limit or density limits in this area. So it's a significant change for sure on these numbers. But that's why we wanted to put this material together to show, what you can get in a 4 or 5 story building. Even a 4-story building getting over 200 units per acre. It is, as Rod said, a much more urban form, both in terms of height and in terms of lot coverage. Each of these buildings is much higher than 53% lot coverage, so it would be a much more urban kind of built environment to do this kind of density. But it is not necessarily high rises in a traditional sense, albeit higher than what you've got now. So with that, maybe we'll stop sharing and open up a conversation and revisit the slides as necessary during the conversation.
Thank you, Darren and Rod. So just to prime the commission, what we're looking for, so tonight was a report out to show the findings and outcome of the research that was done. The second piece of that is that this presentation will also be made to City Council to update them on the outcome of the research. But the third part is that, as you know, we did use some of this data to inform components of the housing element and help us justify our strategy and methodology and argument with HCD, or the State Department of Housing and Community Development, in rezoning portions of the R3 zone. So in order to do so, some of the feedback that we need is, and that last slide was probably a great slide to refer back to if we need to, is in order to accommodate the densities that we are proposing, we're proposing densities on the lower end of the spectrum. What are the values, or what are the development typologies the commission wants to preserve and protect? So for example, the good example that Rod gave was by minimizing allowance of lot coverage, you wind up with taller, higher buildings because you have to build up in order to achieve the density. But if you don't prioritize the open space and you allow the 100% lot coverage or somewhere in between, then you allow for a lower, you don't need the full 85 feet. Maybe you can accomplish the density in 4 stories or 5 stories, depending on where we land. So we're looking for that type of feedback tonight, is where do you want to turn off the faucet on some of these development standards to achieve the type of development that, for lack of better words, isn't so scary.
Can I first ask about SB 330?
Mm-hmm.
Is it the developer's choice of how to deal with someone who's lower income? So they can either offer them a place in the new building, or they can offer rent assistance for 3 years?
No, I don't think so. It's mandated by state legislation. I think that the tenant can choose the path.
Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive. They're actually both required, I think, on the depth of affordability. And then I think there's also a right of first refusal on the new units available to those tenants.
So we're saying, we're gonna assume 25% of the folks who live in any apartment building qualify for this. And that 25% will be a burden that's gonna be carried over into the new development in perpetuity? Or is this just for 3 years, they get rent assistance and then they go to market?
In perpetuity. The rental assistance is meant to cover the period of time that they would be out of their previous unit and the new development is happening. And then they are allowed to come back in. If they choose not to come back into a newly constructed unit, the developer is still on the hook to provide them up to 42 months of support for their new unit wherever they are. And I believe the standard is whatever they were paying before versus what they have to pay in a new unit. The developer has to make up the delta there for a period of 42 months.
Got it. And if that person either never moves back in, or they move back in and then vacate, that developer gets to rent that unit at market price?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. So I just feel like our calculations are giving a little bit of a windfall to these developers because we're assuming worst case scenarios on what they're going to have to do. If we start making decisions about we need to increase density and massing and all these things because we're worried about developers not making money, I would like to see these numbers kind of tightened up a little bit. And maybe because it's such a new law, we don't know how this plays out. But I get it. I mean, first of all, it's wonderfully ironic that the state passes laws mandating that we provide density in our R3 and then passes a law that makes that very hard to accomplish, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. This is just like whiplash to me because we're talking about how can we get more housing units, and now we're being told about this obstacle the state has thrown in front of us, which is going to make this much more difficult. That being said, I'm a little concerned about the numbers we're being presented. But if you want to have it, let me get beyond that and just have an open discussion. Do you want us to pick the lesser evil of height versus lot coverage?
That's an example.
So yeah, let me sort of also address the first comment. If we came back in 6 months, these numbers could be different because it's based on market data.
Yeah.
So you have to accept that this is a range based on assumptions that are made today. If we came back in 6 months or in 12 months, we can be having the same conversation that this is no longer relative because it's relative with the time that the analysis is done. But the idea is that as we progress through this, we're consistently making decisions based on the real data that we have at hand. I'd actually venture to say that there's several properties in our city that we're probably unaware of that have far greater than 25% of protected units. So we're probably actually being more conservative than we could, or less conservative than we could. And so I just for context, for the first part of what your remark was, the second piece is, for in short, pick the lesser of two evils, if that's how you want to look at it. What we're really looking for is what's the balance that the commission would like to see? What's your appetite for height versus preservation of open space? What's your appetite for lot consolidation? Because in the same fashion that adjusting the nozzle on lot coverage, if you mandate the larger lot sizes, then it gives you greater flexibility to achieve better articulation throughout the site design, and you can spread the development out a little bit more than you could if it was a smaller parcel. And so that's what the type of feedback that we're looking for. We're going to have to continuously look at the numbers as we develop this so that when we do make the decision, it is the most informed decision. But right now we're operating on a very conservative basis in terms of density. And we've already heard the feedback during the housing element discussion that, we don't want to lose the lever of the DA. And so we already know that piece. I've got notes on that, but looking for other potential levers that you want to preserve.
Well, to me, the big scary change is going from 32 units to 120 units. That's.
And we're not at, no, we're not. That's what's currently
Well,
there,
you're,
right? But our
okay,
current
so you're right,
zoning
from
is
27 to 120. And, that's kind of the elephant in the room. My question is if putting the affordable stuff aside, because market rate, those equations were done with all market rate being the exact same number. I'm assuming the whole reason to redevelop is to increase market rate prices, and therefore, hopefully those numbers can come down and a project will pencil.
I don't know. I mean, so to get to an acre, you have to have 5 lots, basically. I think if anything, those numbers are exponentially higher than that.
Is that right?
It's 400,000 a unit right now is the average. So you're buying a 4-unit property for 1.6 million. You can't buy a single-family home for. I don't know. The exercise frustrates me, to be
Well,
honest.
you're in this space more than we are, so you go through some of these models in a way that we probably don't do as often. So I guess the question is, are those realistic projections, and therefore are the densities right?
I mean, I think the densities are right. It wouldn't be my choice of where we try to achieve that. I don't know. It's frustrating because not to the consultant and not to staff. You all are doing an excellent job. But I think Carol Wingate and I sat 3 years ago and went through this exact exercise and came up with the exact result. It's really hard to effectuate without these massive changes.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess that's not the question that that we are addressing today. Yeah, I would go out versus up.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say, I do think that the conversation about our parking standard is something that we're ready to have across the board, because that's as outdated as our density there, right? I mean, whether you build a studio or a 4-bedroom unit, you're still, based on our current code, required to provide the same amount of parking,
Right.
which isn't how you facilitate different types of units being built there.
Yeah, and I would like to see open space and on a case-by-case basis. If there's a project right next to a park, for example, you may have an opportunity to have less open space. But there's so many other tall buildings around that if there was some articulation, and I think it's about massing. A tall building, an 85-foot tall building, can look more delicate than a 50-foot building if designed properly.
And Pacific Coast Commons is about 85 feet, right?
It varies from 6 to 8 stories, I believe, throughout the site.
It's approximately 85 feet, but I can look up the number.
Okay, no, that.
Are we only discussing this strip by PCH?
No, this was the
This is
study.
all of the
That was-
R3.
That was the study area. It's not all of the R3. It's the portions of the R3 that were the overlay. It was the blue hashed,
Okay, so all
So
down
also
Imperial.
Can we see
Imperial.
that again?
yeah, we don't, that was Veronica Tam's presentation,
Oh,
but
yeah.
it was down Imperial and south of Grand, between Grand and Franklin, essentially, and then along the backside of PCH, in that same image that we had here just a moment ago. Roughly those 3 areas.
Because we're rezoning the R3 zone, so it would apply,
It's all.
and the overlay. We're only talking about the overlay now?
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're talking about, we've made this promise to Sacramento, how do we bring it to reality? Okay.
Gotcha. So this is all R3, what we're talking about here?
Not all 3, just the
the overlay.
the
Just the
overlay.
overlay.
How do we deal with the density we have and bring it up to the density that Sacramento wants?
So I threw some low-hanging fruit out there about height, because I think that's an easy one to talk about. But there's other, parking is also, something that needs to be addressed, and that could be relative to location. We could have different parking depending on proximity to transit or other TDM measures, or proximity to, where it's at in the city, or transit services. Same thing with open space. There can be different standards, a sliding scale for requirements on open space, depending on how far you are from a certain acreage per 1,000 residents or something along those lines in the city. And so there's ways of developing these standards that address what you're sharing. We're just trying to capture what are the priority areas. If we have to hit these densities, What are the priority areas? You know, preserving the DA lever. Is it, you know, bulk and mass? You know, the other ways of strategizing, dealing with bulk and mass, and maybe unit mix regulations and mandating maximum unit sizes and unit mixes of projects so that you control the building envelope through that mechanism, and that gets back to another discussion that we're having on micro units, but it doesn't have to apply to that. It could be 1, 2, 3 bedroom, you know, maximum unit sizes to help keep that envelope, you know, a certain form.
Right. Well, unit size is a big one. Could we ask the consultants to go back to their examples? Was it the Seattle one? Yeah, 205 per unit. I mean, what are the unit sizes of that? Do you guys know?
I don't know the precise mix. We may be able to find that out, but presumably, given the limited height on it, it's probably something like micro units.
Okay.
And no parking.
Be essentially
And no
studios and 1 bedrooms in the, I would say, 300 to 500 square foot average range, just to make it fit within that building at that density.
Yeah, that building certainly has no open space, no parking, and you're looking at micro units.
It is, just to give the specifics, it is 4 stories, and the average unit size is 430 square feet, and they are largely studios.
Are there units in there without windows?
That's a new dorm.
They have virtual windows.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
So again, we're not making any decisions tonight. We're getting feedback so that we know where to focus our time on crunching numbers and trying to squeeze the density where it goes, and just trying to give examples of different ways of doing that.
What are the chances that the state says your overlay isn't dense enough to be effectuated?
You know, we've had conversations with HCD, and I'm pretty confident that they've accepted our methodology.
If I may, if the commission still wants to see the housing overlay map, we could do that. We just have to ask El Segundo TV to show that, please, which we've put up on our laptop here.
While you're doing that, is there a way, Michael, to incentivize, like, I don't know, the focus to be on larger lots to begin with versus?
Yeah, so we can require that the minimum lot size to take advantage of such a density has to be a minimum of 1 acre, 2 acre, 3 acre, or, you know, you can establish a new, because the earlier slide showed the current minimum lot size is 7,000 square feet. So we can increase that minimum lot size requirement to achieve a certain density.
So basically require them to combine lots in order to have that density so that we can have a project that's just not sticking straight up.
Right.
Okay, that seems logical.
Yeah.
Chair Baldino, just wanted to confirm, the PCC project was at 85 feet maximum.
Thanks, Paul.
Would we be able to have different height requirements in different areas of town, or is this a one-size-fits-all?
We can look for, I think, I don't want to close the door on anything, and so, you know, if that's something we need to look at, different height regulations for different areas of the city, we can look at that as a lever.
Because it may not be out of place next to PCH in Pacific Coast Commons, but all up and down Imperial, and especially in the southwest quadrant. That's all low-rise buildings, residential, even though they're multifamily homes, they look like residential neighborhoods, lots of trees. So if you're gonna have 5-story, 6-story homes, it seems it makes sense to put that where there's already massing of that scale, so it blends into the neighborhood, as opposed to low-lying 2-story homes, and all of a sudden you've got a 5-story.
But even along Washington, I mean, I guess you have the park as a barrier, but you have 85 feet along PCH for Pacific Coast Commons. I mean, in my mind, it would be step back from that before then you get to all
Yeah,
the
like
single
a
family.
staggered, not as high as PCH,
Yeah.
but kind of like a, you know, I don't
So
know,
you're
a buffer
transitioning.
zone, transition zone, so. And I guess we're lucky they do have the park over there, so there's some green space at least.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, quite the puzzle.
Yeah, well, it's.
Sorry, I don't have any solutions for
I
you
mean, I
guys.
do think we need to look at parking standards. Not that I'm a proponent of having less overall, but just the way that our mix is currently, like a one size fits all.
Right. That and other maybe alternative solutions to parking, you know, transportation demand options. Or other mobility options.
And remind me the density of Pacific Coast Commons? What are we at there?
83 units to the acre.
And that project included a small component of commercial where the R3, these would not include the commercial component.
Right, right.
So that
You could
affects
have ground
height,
floor
it
units.
affects the finances, it affects, you know, parking and things like that. But it's a good comparison. It's the closest comparison we have.
I think it's smart to look at the parking, but I also think in reality, it has to be a project that's going to be useful in the market. Like, I'm not gonna pay market rate if I can't park my car at where I live. So if I'm a builder, I'm gonna have parking, even if the city doesn't require it. If I wanna have a successful project, I'm gonna have parking, because I'm gonna want people to move into there. But I understand what you're saying, the one size fits all is not gonna work, especially when we're talking about density.
Yeah, you just won't be able to park it. I think Pacific Coast Commons will probably be the standard for what our parking here looks like. What about the section of, I mean, it's not Smoky Hollow specific plan, but west, what is that, southwest corner, are those, I know along Washington Park, those are mostly rentals. I was thinking that a lot of those units are ownership, right? So just from a like practicality standpoint.
In the southwest corner?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of multifamily there.
Is there a lot of
Yeah,
apart,
But, yeah, there are some single
like a
family.
number of townhome projects that really are you gonna, is that gonna be developed, redeveloped?
Yeah, and you can probably get away with some more height in front of the refinery. You know, it kind of acts as a visual buffer even. I was thinking even on
Yeah.
Imperial, you get a sound buffer by height, by putting some height up in a way.
We could put that in the requirement. Concrete brick wall,
Exactly,
I don't know.
facing the airport.
giant deodorizer pads to help.
I don't know, Ryan, the Moose is your best bet in that area.
The moose is gonna live
Moose is
forever.
loose.
I'm gonna make you a moose believer before my days are through. All right, any other discussions? I feel like we're rambling now.
And we don't have to beat
It's
this
so hard
any
to do.
further.
I mean, it's tough.
It's
You-
gonna
it's
be
like
difficult to thread the needle.
make an
but
impossible
you gotta
puzzle
do it.
work.
Right.
So that's why we've got intelligent staff folk like yourself to figure this out and come back to us with something great.
That's why we hire consultants.
All right, well, thank you for that. Thank you to our consultants for your good work. It's always educational to get this kind of input. All right, well, our next on the agenda, we're going to move on to a report from our Community Development Director.
I'll defer to our planning manager, Eduardo.
Sure, thank you. So, as part of the distribution of materials, I had included the remaining 2022 Planning Commission forecast. We have quite a bit of projects coming before you over the next 2 months, which we're only really having 2, maybe a third Planning Commission meeting. Which brings me to seeing what the appetite is with respect to the December 22nd meeting and whether there is any desire on the Planning Commission to cancel that, and if so, would it like to substitute it with a special meeting before, the week before, so that you're not in the, leading, in the week leading up to, well, only a couple days off of Christmas, so. Just wanted to see if what the commission's preference is with regards to that.
You will have business on the 22nd that needs to get done, because right now there's nothing listed there.
Well, we could potentially have the micro unit ordinance, and which is why they're in brown. Yeah, and the discussion of the Smoky Hollow Amendment pushed. Alternatively, if there's a common date, perhaps the week after the 8th, which would perhaps be the 15th. Yeah, December 15th. In lieu of the December 22nd meeting, we could agendize those two items, and if there's anything else that needs to come in.
Yeah, I would prefer to, if you're gonna want public participation, you're gonna have to move that away from the holiday season. So I guess the week after the 8th, if that's possible.
We're willing, we can do that. We just need to make sure that we would have a quorum, and if so, we will agendize those items.
Yeah.
It's okay with me. Oh,
Yeah,
go ahead.
it's preferred for me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and do you call an audible, after Thanksgiving and say, hey, we don't have that much stuff going, we'll just cancel the one on the special meeting?
Yeah, well, we'll be coordinating closely with the subcommittee for the micro unit ordinance. So that is a possibility. I mean, we were shooting for the 8th, but we can, do the 15th, which is good. I think Paul and staff were at the point where we've kind of drafted up something, so we'll be reaching out to the subcommittee soon to make sure we're in the right direction with that. And then, but more important, I shouldn't say more importantly, but also just as important is the Smoky Hollow Specific Plan Amendment. And, we really want to get your feedback in terms of, and our goal with that meeting is to also have our consultant there as well, so they can kind of hear and help navigate the discussion, similar to what we're doing right now with the EPS study. More of a discussion to see, where the commission wants us to make those appropriate amendments. I mean, from a staff perspective, we have jotted down several points that the commission has alluded to over the past year or so. And we've also, from experience in implementing the specific plan, have jotted down several things that we would also like to have amended. But we want to take this opportunity more as a group discussion and take advantage of our consultants' ability to, garner more discussion and ideas and get, some more direction from the commission, and maybe expand the opportunities of amending that specific plan.
By that time, we've already obtained stakeholder input from building owners in Smoky Hollow and people who are actually there?
No,
Or
we will
you're
not.
coming to us first and then you'll go do some outreach?
Right.
Okay.
Correct.
All right, yeah, the week after the 8th, I'll be around.
Yep.
Yep,
It's probably best, better than the 22nd.
yep.
Yeah, okay, so we will shoot for the, having a special meeting on December 15th, perfect. And then also included in that was the forecasting for 2023. There's a few things already on there. Again, this is a little fluid, so, but it is at least just a couple things that we, want to bring back to you annually, and we're, trying to put those on the docket. So for example, in February, we'll have our annual general plan progress report, which, is just, more of a receive and file that goes onto the council and onto the state. And then, as you can see, in December, we'll have the, which is what I put on here too, and we can do that on the 8th, is the election of the PC chair and vice chair, which is in accordance with your bylaws. So anyhow, I just want to give that to you and thank you for the feedback, and we'll at least, we know that we can have a December 15th as a potential for a special meeting. So thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and which means that the December 22nd meeting is canceled, correct?
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Yes. All right, planning commissioner comments?
Just thank staff for all your time. I know this is a lot, and it's making us think proactively, so I do appreciate that.
Don't forget to vote, November 8th. Very important elections.
Yes, and happy Halloween. We've got the Kiwanis Golf Tournament is tomorrow. I strongly encourage everyone to come out. It's a great fundraiser. We've got the Halloween Frolic this weekend. And then Mrs. Keldover's hosting an open house at the Moose for new membership. So feel free to come on down, meet your neighbors and friends. With that, we are adjourned. Our next meeting is November 10th, 2020. Thank you, everyone. Where's my gavel?